We are used to right-wing newspapers warning us that immigration to Britain is too high. The narrative this week, though, has flipped. We're now told it's, in fact, emigration that's the problem. So this is the front page of the Daily Mail. So you can see at the top you've got a rather nasty story about Benefit Street, because we're bringing that whole anti-welfare ideology back from the early 2010s, apparently. But then the main headline there is the brain drain from Starmer's socialist chaos. Similar stories appeared in the Times and the Telegraph. So the Telegraph had Exodus as young workers flee high-tax Britain. These stories were prompted by the release of the migration figures on Thursday, which showed that net migration to the UK had plummeted to just over 2,000. That was welcomed as good news by most of the press, but a narrative has emerged that this is partly to do with young, ambitious Britons fleeing the UK. And this is from that Telegraph article, the headline of which I just showed you. So they say, young workers are fleeing Labour's high-tax Britain, with under 35s leading a near-record exodus. A net 110,000 British people aged 16 to 34 emigrated in the year to March. That's according to the Office for National Statistics, accounting for 2/3 of all departing Britons. The ONS has broken down its migration data by age for the first time, revealing how Britain's ageing society is hemorrhaging young people while older expats are returning home. They say the figures will fuel claims that Rachel Reeves' record tax rises have made Britain unattractive to the young and aspirant. Now, it's interesting the angle the Telegraph reaches for is immediately that Britons leaving the country, young Britons, young ambitious Britons leaving the country, are most concerned about tax rises. Now, the data is poor, right? But having recent memories of being under 34, I'm 35 now, so it was recent history. Or am I 36? I always forget. Anyway, I was born in 9. I think I'm 36. I would suggest it's housing costs that will always and remain my biggest concern. So even as a 36-year-old, tax. Actually, I was going to say I prefer not to pay, but no, I'm happy to pay tax. The thing I'm annoyed about is paying my rent to my landlord, because I know it's not going on public services, it's going on his mortgage. The Telegraph, though, obviously has reason to downplay that factor. And that's because they're the paper of record for NIMBYs and older homeowners. So, for example, this is just one screenshot from their homepage today. Under their story about how young people are fleeing the country because of tax, not mentioning housing, they have families paying inheritance tax to double by 2031. Obviously, that's as a bad news story. Then you've got someone saying, I've paid millions in taxes. Now mansion tax has ruined my retirement. Another story, satellites to spy on homeowners for Labour's property tax raid. And then 30,000 more homeowners will be dragged into mansion tax by 2028. So this is all scare stories about the fact that people who were lucky enough to buy a house for 20 grand in 1980 are now going to have to spend a bit of money every year because they are the luckiest people to ever live, right? And now the Telegraph is massively campaigning against that. And I would say that it is people sitting in those big houses, potentially opposing houses in their neighbourhood, although I don't think that is the biggest reason for the housing crisis. But I would say the Telegraph readership, right, isn't necessarily on the side of the young 30-year-old who might be considering moving to Australia. So I take their moralising about this with a pinch of salt. I also think, though, there are serious questions about whether this narrative at all, so not just about the causes of people leaving, but whether there is actually an exodus of people, whether that narrative actually adds up at all. We've got a chart here. It shows how immigration has changed over recent years. So there have been... there was a new methodology, introduced in 2021, which makes comparison somewhat difficult. It's because the background here, before 2021, they used to do surveys at airports and extrapolates that literally have a clipboard at airports. Now they use DWP data, which seems more sensible. In any case, what you need to know is that since the methodology change, British emigration has remained flat at just over 200,000 people. So the number of British people leaving hasn't really changed at all. And obviously after the EU referendum, the amount of non-EU emigration has increased. But in the last 2 years, it's the increase of non-EU emigration, which is actually driving the emigration change. So the big change we've had in the past few years, since Starmer and Reeves came to power, isn't that loads of British people are leaving because they're like, I don't trust Rachel Reeves with my taxes. The people who are leaving are non-EU migrants. Now, by the way, it's important to note, it's unlikely that's because we've become a hostile environment. It's probably much more just mechanical. So net immigration of non-EU migrants or even EU migrants is often because they've come for a specific purpose. So maybe they came on a student visa and now they're going back. And obviously, because we had such high immigration figures over the 2 years ago, that means that a lot of those people are now going to be going back after they've done their degree. So the overall increase in immigration seems somewhat mechanical based on the fact that we had very high net immigration over the past 2 years.
Do I think it's a manufactured issue? No, I don't. I think that an ambitious deputy head teacher or nursing graduate or doctor, the reality is that this country doesn't work for them. They're going to struggle to get on the housing ladder. They're going to walk down the local high street. They're going to see a place really in disarray. Most towns and cities in the UK simply aren't nice places to live. They're not nice places to raise children. And pay isn't what it was. So in many jobs, particularly things like the public sector, education, healthcare, it's not a nice country to begin your career anymore. It isn't. It's not built for those people, right? And so I find it strange to say that they wouldn't leave. Why wouldn't they leave? Why wouldn't they leave? British qualifications are some of the most prestigious in the world. You're an English speaker. There is a huge global market for your skills. In almost any industry, why wouldn't they leave? So this idea that people won't leave, I find kind of ridiculous. I feel like, again, it's cope. If you've built your entire political economic system around old people, of course working age people are going to leave the country. Of course they are. The amount of countries I've been to, Poland, Sweden, Italy even, France, Germany, and there are young people, they've left. And they say, and I say, well, why did you leave? Well, I'm not going to go back because I don't want to pay student debt. I'm not going to pay my student loan back. It means, besides anything else, I've got 300-400 quid extra at the end of every month here if I work here. I'm not going to go back. So I don't think it's a manufactured panic, no. And again, I think there's this tendency on bits of the left where if the right says something, we have to say something else. Your eyes don't lie. Your eyes don't lie. If everybody in their late 20s, early 30s is saying, I'm really not happy here, I don't think I'm making the most of my life, we get one shot in life. The visibility of other countries and other economies has never been higher on social media. The ability to work and live elsewhere has never been easier. The costs of it are pretty good. You can still stay in touch with family members in a way that you couldn't 20, 30 years ago with WhatsApp and, video calls, etc. Why wouldn't they? So even if these numbers aren't correct, and I kind of think they are. I said this a couple of years ago, actually, and I got in a bit of a conversation with somebody who's at The Economist magazine. They said, no, they're not leaving. Well, I find that very counterintuitive, personally. And people say, well, this person said this thing to you. That's just anecdote. Here's the data. The data can be changed 2 or 3 years down the line, right? This is why whenever you're talking about data about GDP, productivity, wages, immigration, look at a 5-year, 10-year period. Look at a 5-year period. That's what I'm interested in. And I personally feel like post-COVID, we're now moving into a world where actually we should be thinking more about immigration. Yes, we should be thinking about it more. If you're on £70,000 as a deputy head teacher in this country, you're in the 40% tax bracket for earnings over £50,000. You've got your student loan to think about. It's really expensive, maybe to get on the housing ladder. You can earn twice as much money working in the Gulf. You can earn a lot more money in the US. Ditto nurses. There's loads of professions like this. And I think we kind of have to get real. And I think for the right as well, Michael, it's a real challenge because they've been obsessed with stopping people coming into the country. And by the way, when you're talking about healthcare workers or care workers, we've got to have that because we've had a fertility rate below 2.1 for 50 years. We've got to have some of those people. We can have a conversation about how many, what industries, but we've got to have some of them, okay? But alongside that, they've just completely taken their eye off the ball about people leaving. I said this years ago on GB News, 2-3 years ago. I said, look, you're worried about people coming? Be worried about people leaving because the Tories since 2010 have built a political economy in this country which smashes young people, smashes them. And they weren't taking it seriously. But why would a smart kid, I say kid now because I'm 41, 42, why would a smart person in their mid-20s with good qualifications, hardworking, ambitious, you tell me why they would stay in the UK? You tell me. If it's not family, and of course that's why most people don't go, it's because of family. But if they want housing security and they want a nice place for their kids to grow up, and they don't want to be in a ton of debt, and they want a bit of expendable income, and they want to eat out on a nice high street which hasn't been destroyed by big tech, the UK is probably not the place to do it. Go as a British person, go to Poland, which was a poor country until relatively recently. Go to Poland, go to Poznan, go to Krakow, go to Gdansk, go to Wrocław, go to Warsaw. All of these cities have a much nicer public feel to them than maybe any British city except Manchester and London and Glasgow. Maybe. I mean that. Our cities and towns are not nice places to live. So I think there's just so much stuff that stacks up for me, Michael. Yes, I think young people are leaving. I think they will continue to leave until we have a broader settlement which doesn't completely disadvantage young people, working age people, then I think it will get worse.
I suppose there's a danger, isn't there? We're saying it seems right, so let's ignore the data. But I do take your point that sort of these things are often revised afterwards. I mean, as sort of many of the stories on the show today have said. And I do agree with you that there would be lots of reasons to leave Britain, but I do think you have to sort of have a debate which is to some degree grounded in the data, because lots of, it seems intuitive to lots of people that crime is completely out of control and that we live in the most dangerous time ever. And then it's important to sort of bring people back to the data, which says that that's not quite the case. When we're in the studio together, we will have this as a big debate because of some of our sound problems and technical problems. We're not going to do a back and forth here. I'm going to go to the next part of this story to see if you agree with me here, which is, I suppose, concerns how the right are using this idea of emigration to suggest that people in their 30s are a particular way, which I think, again, the data doesn't necessarily bear out. So the emigration story has been used to invoke a meme, which is now incredibly popular on the online right. You might have seen it. Neil Bryan, a very online Tory MP, in response to this idea that sort of there is an emigration crisis, he said 99% of net British emigration is people under 35. Crazy brain drain. Nick 30 is off to Australia or Dubai. Now, Nick 30 is the main character in this meme. It was originally from France. And you can see you got Nick here. So he's a young professional and he's very annoyed because all his money it's quite a racist meme, really, because all his money is going to Africa via UK aid, even though that's a very low proportion of GDP, to a black man called Karim, who lives in social housing and is sending the money via Western Union to Africa. So again, as I said, it's quite a racist meme. And then it's going to the NHS and old people on P&O cruises. So the idea is that he's being milked for everything by people who aren't working. The issue with this, I mean, beyond the fact that there's lots of distasteful elements of this, the factual issue here in terms of sort of saying that this is the annoyed, young, ambitious Briton who is turning to the right, who is really annoyed that they're giving money to old people and black people, essentially, is what's being suggested in this meme, is that if Nick is a 30-year-old who lives in London, he's almost certain to be a Labour or Green voter, right? He might not see his struggles in the same way that they're caricatured by the online right, including Tory MPs. And I want to go to a clip, which I think shows quite how far off the deep end some people on the right have gone when it comes to, I suppose, misunderstanding young Britain. So this is Alex Phillips on Talk TV.
What are we? Why don't we just put a big red carpet on the White Cliffs of Dover and say, do you know what? If you're not from Britain, come. And the last few people here who are working, who are breaking their backs to try and save what is left of this country, will just give it all to you, regardless of who they are. Come on, help yourself at the buffet of Britain. And meanwhile, everybody else who's fed up with that, the younger generation, 2/3 of those who have left between 18 and 35, they've just gone, well, it's not for me. It's very clear the people in power don't like me. They don't see my future. They're not prioritising me. They're not putting me in the front of the queue. They're not honouring the fact that I was born and bred here, that my parents, my grandparents, their parents and grandparents helped build this great nation. What is there? This is not a country. This is a blimmin' farce. I'm off. And, I can't blame them because I feel a sort of strange existential depression over all of this. In some moments I'm thinking, do you know what? Maybe I should zip off to Poland or Hungary or somewhere where I can still smell the reality of Christendom, because I don't even know what's going on anymore. I'm fed up with it.
To me, why this summed up what the right get wrong is she's saying, you know what we need to be more like is Hungary. And I'm doubtful that there is an exodus of young people from Britain, but if there is an exodus of young people from Britain, they're not going to Hungary, right? People like to live, young people, yes, they probably would like better housing, right? People across all age groups sort of seem to think our immigration system is a bit dysfunctional, but they're not looking to live in a socially conservative, deeply Christian country where homosexuality and liberal newspapers is suppressed and sidelined, right? Young people are liberal, right? There is a danger, and I think there is a serious danger, that sort of young people begin to sort of say, oh, maybe the reason I'm not advancing is because of people on benefits or people in council housing or whatever. And I think that's something that the left should resist. There's a danger of that. But the right are really, really misunderstanding the country if they think that Nick, aged 30, wants to move to Hungary. And that's the big misunderstanding. And I also think that is the big weakness of the right's argument on lots of this, because they say, the society we want to have, it has to be more conservative. We've become too liberal. There's too much migration. What we need to have is some ethnic homogeneity so that we can have more social trust, etc., etc. And where they point to is Hungary. And then at the same time, they're complaining about young, ambitious people wanting to move away. Young, ambitious people don't want to live in Hungary. The thing that would genuinely cause an exodus from this country, I think, could be Nigel Farage coming to power. Because if you look at what are the values of young Britons, they are the complete opposite of Nigel Farage. And actually, young people in Britain tend to be quite absolutist, to be honest, about some of their values. They see Nigel Farage as standing against everything they believe in. And I do really think that if Reform come to power, that lots more people will leave than currently are leaving. So the idea that sort of young people are protesting with their feet, they want to live in a white Christian country, that's just not true. Thank God it's not true. But yeah, I think the right are not getting this. I think the story about immigration is going to be an interesting one in the coming years. The story about youth resentment is going to also be an interesting one. There are countries where more young people do vote for the far right. So France and some of continental Europe is a bit like that. I still think most of them vote left, but there is a much bigger cohort of young people who are turning to the radical right. That isn't happening in the UK yet. It's a risk. But as I say, the idea that Alex Phillips is proposing that young people are going to go to Hungary because they want to live in a Christian country, it's a joke. And it's kind of crazy that that's sort of being cast on Murdoch TV day after day after day, because it's also completely misleading her audience, because her audience probably is older conservative people who are being told, oh yeah, there's this huge clamoring among young ambitious people in Britain to live in an ethno state. That's not true.